Maybe we should get started. I'm sure more people will be coming, but hello everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Ricky Ponsalan. I'm director of the Museum Studies program and also associate professor here at the School of Information. One of the thrilling things that I get to do as director of the Museum Studies program is to welcome and introduce visiting scholars like Josh. Uh, but before I introduce Josh, I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Michigan's origin in a land grant from the Anishinaabe, Potawatomi, and Wyandot nations. In the case of this university, the land was given with the promise to provide education and service to the descendants of those peoples, which is a goal that we value and recognize even though we have yet to sufficiently realize it. The land, nonetheless, continues to benefit us materially and intellectually and remains a debt of obligation to provide education, benefit, and knowledge to all peoples of the state of Michigan. Now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker who's actually here for until tomorrow. And in fact, if you haven't heard of the workshop that Josh is conducting tomorrow at 10 a.m., we still have 5 spots. So if you email the Museum Studies program, if you would like to get a spot at tomorrow's workshop at 10 a.m. at Rackham, please let us know, and I'm sure Josh will talk about it. That he's gonna make stuff explode, I don't know. Like boom. Okay, let me do the formality of introducing Josh Bell. Dr. Joshua Bell is curator of globalization at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of Natural History, combining ethnographic fieldwork with research in museums and archives. He examines the shifting local and global network of relationships between persons, artifacts, and the environment. To date, he has carried out research with communities in the Prairie Delta of Papua New Guinea, with historic oceanic collections, and on cellular telephony in Washington, D.C. He is currently the chair of NMNH's Anthropology Department and is the steward of the museum's Oceania, African, and South American collections, as well as the collections of the National Anthropological Archive. He is a founding member of Recovering Voices and co-directs the annual Mother Tongue Film Festival. He also directs the Summer Institute in Museum Anthropology, or SIMA, a summer course funded by the National Science Foundation that teaches graduate students how to effectively and ethically engage with museum and archival collections. So, Josh, welcome to Michigan and Go Blue.
I don't normally dress up, so this is unusual. Thank you, Ricky. And thank you, Deirdre and Amy and all of you in Museum Studies for hosting me. Can you hear me all right? Is that? No? It's not working. All right, we're going to use this. All right, let's try that. Better? Better, but closer to the face. All right. And, thank you, Ricky, Deirdre, Amy in the back, for hosting me. It's a great opportunity for me to come. Ricky very kindly gave a land acknowledgement, and I just want to echo that sentiment and also just say that where I'm coming from is Piscataway territory in Washington, D.C., where the Smithsonian, indeed my home, rests. And I mention it, often land acknowledgements are kind of seen as this new performative thing. But coming from the Smithsonian and at the National Museum of Natural History, and given the complicated history of anthropology, I think it's really important that we do foreground these relationships, given the kind of complicated and history of hurt and settler colonialism that's ongoing. The talk today it's my views. I'm not representing the Smithsonian, but I do work there, which is wonderful. I wanted to start, and I'm going to be talking about this exhibit, as you probably got a sense. But as a prelude to this, I don't know how many of you have read *The Dispossessed* by Ursula K. Le Guin. Anyone? It's a classic. If you haven't, go out and buy it. She starts with this wonderful statement and about a wall and just the kind of issues about boundaries and thinking through. It's a wall that separates two civilizations. One lives on a moon, one lives on this other planet, and it's effectively a metaphor about the Cold War. But the kind of bringing up the notion of the wall is also thinking through this idea of perspective. As a side note, one of the things I love about this book, and I put it in the exhibit, is that she talks about the creation of an interstellar cell phone, the Ansible, which actually helps to transcend and eradicate difference. So there's a little cellular telephony or interstellar telephony. But I bring it up in the context of this talk and, looking back. I don't know if anyone's done this. You write abstracts and then you look back at them and like, wow, what did I promise? But I bring it up in the context of this because Anthropology in a natural history museum has imposed a lot of walls and barriers, both real and both metaphorical. And so part of the project around this exhibit is to kind of reposition anthropology in the 21st century. And as I'll get into, kind of make an argument that, both anthropology needs to do better, and be about everyone, and that particularly in a natural history museum, that natural history is about everyone and for everyone. Not a very radical kind of idea, but within a museum and with a complicated history like my own, tied into all sorts of things, a kind of an important point to make. What I'm going to do, though, to start, before I dive into the exhibit, is give you kind of three sets of origins or stories about about the Smithsonian, about my path to do this exhibit as kind of a prelude, and about some of the research that's informed this. So the first is the Smithsonian. I'm assuming everyone has been to maybe the Smithsonian or at least knows of it, right? Founded in 1846, 19 museums, and they're constantly on deck, or new ones, 9 research centers, and 156 million objects. The museum is the largest museum complex in the world, and it is deeply, and I'm thinking of right now, we're getting ready to celebrate the 250 years of the nation. And if you know our history, then you know that the Smithsonian's intimately tied up to that complicated history of settler colonialism and imperialism. And I mention that because our collections go back to the beginning of U.S., both domestic but also foreign exploration. And in this case, I'm showing you a picture, a drawing, an engraving from the U.S. exploring expedition, which was the first U.S.-sponsored scientific expedition circumnavigating the globe. This is a picture of a club dance in Fiji where the expedition stayed. Interestingly, that expedition, like many expeditions, was scientifically focused, but also commercially focused. And a lot of their work was actually trying to track out and check on whaling, commercial whaling at that time. So I mention that to say that science is always part of capitalism, and my museum is not outside of that. Maybe for the anthropologists in the room, a slightly controversial statement. Anthropology started at the Smithsonian, despite Boaz's argument otherwise. But we are the origin, perhaps not the origin that the discipline likes to remember, given the kind of pathway of scientific racism that we're all being reminded of by pieces in the Washington Post, importantly, as elsewhere. But nevertheless, the origin of anthropology in many ways, and here I'm thinking of the Bureau of American Ethnology and other avenues in the museum. But that is to say that our museum has a massive set of collections that are tied up with those histories, and they represent a really interesting history of both those particular historical moments, intercultural encounters, And our museum, these anthropology collections sit within the larger collection of natural history, which is the kind of heir to the Smithsonian's original collections. We have at current count about 146 million objects. Now, part of what we do at the museum is to address that. We have a repatriation group, even though we're not part of NAGPRA. We fall under the NMAI Act, which I can talk about later. But we do a lot of things to kind of address these histories, both through repatriation, through programs such as Recovering Voices, which I had a hand in helping, which brings communities into collections and kind of helps activate them in new ways, both for and by Indigenous communities, which is really important. So kind of giving up our own research interests and really facilitating access. I think other things to note that the Smithsonian is taking important steps in is our ethical returns and shared stewardship, which came out in April 2022, and then more recently to address the very large and very deeply problematic collections of human remains that we have that are non-native, and this is a human dignity group that is forming to address that. And so I mention these things because I think we have to know the past of the Smithsonian, and just to say that now as chair, I'm very intimately involved in trying to help do the right thing. But this collection and this kind of platform is something I'm going to come back to in terms of the role of natural history, the role of public scholarship, etc. So another origin story for me is my work in Papua New Guinea. I've had the distinct honor, pleasure, privilege of working in the Prairie Delta on the South Coast really since 2000. And it was working there and watching this rollout of cell phones. Cell phones came into the country in about 2007, that what I was witnessing and experiencing personally with the advent of cellular telephony, and particularly the smartphone, I was watching it impact the communities that I have known and work with. And so a gem of an idea to kind of think about technology and its interface. And I should say my work, as Ricky pointed out, has been, well, not always focused on cell phones, always kind of interested in these connections between people, place, and objects. And technology obviously falls into that. So it was thinking about what was happening there and then having this opportunity to get this job, Curator of Globalization, which, as I like to joke, kind of allows me to do almost anything. But in thinking about globalization, and particularly when I started the job in 2008, which was in the wake of the iPhone and the kind of the popularization of this smartphone technology, that the gem of an idea around this exhibit and wider project. As with all good exhibits, those of you in museum studies have probably heard about, one needs to write a book about exhibits that never happened. This was an exhibit that almost didn't happen. I originally proposed it in 2011 or 10-11. The then director was greenlighted it, and then we had a new director, our current director, Kurt Johnson, and he understandably put it on hold due to a new hall that our Hall of Deep Time that he had to raise $35 million for. So the exhibit kind of went on the back burner, but as part of that, having watched the dreams of some of my colleagues burn and then talk to them about the legacy of their annoyance that this one exhibit never happened, I think in my mind, rightfully decided, well, let's do a parallel research track. And I happened to end up working with Joel Kuipers, who is a long-term linguistic anthropologist working both in Indonesia and in the US, and then Alex Dent. And since 2011, we've done a series of projects. The first was to look at migrants and cell phones, and it turns out that that was incredibly hard. And then stumbled into working with third-party repair vendors. And that was actually incredibly wonderful and productive. That led us down this path of thinking about breakdown and trouble, and thinking about that as an analytic to understand what these things do or don't do, or what we wish they do. And then we had an NSF funding to work with 2 high schools in Washington, D.C. to understand the role of cell phones inside high schools and teaching and stuff, which was fascinating to do. a lot of funding, and also for me, funding from Winogren, NSF, a range of Smithsonian, has resulted in a variety of publications, but then also kind of introduced for me, and I cannot strongly advocate it enough, just kind of team ethnography and working with a group, which was fascinating. I'm happy. I'll be touching on this in the workshop, but really interesting, kind of opening my eyes to what anthropology could be, should be, and just thinking about collaborations. I wanted to give, this is a new thing, and I realized after I did this slide, I realized that anyone who doesn't see their book in this slide is going to be annoyed with me. But the work that I do is informed by a lot of different scholarship. And I think one of the wonderful things, as you'll see in this exhibit, that kind of examines the cradle to cradle and the cultural and social implications of our devices is that there's a lot of scholarship out there that both deals with media on the one hand, deals with indigenous understandings of materiality, deals with infrastructure, et cetera. And so a lot of my work then is informed by this kind of relational perspective that perhaps one thinks of most closely aligned with Marilyn Strathern. So this relational indigenous view that's in New Guinea, but also found out throughout the Pacific, as well as thinking through issues around more than human relations that you see in the work of Donna Haraway and others. And then also through more inclusive of indigenous terminologies and notions of kin. And here I'm thinking of Kim Tallbear, as well as people like Max LeBron. Obviously, bringing in indigenous concepts, one has to be very careful with what one does with them. But I think this kind of connection and sensibility of interrelation is, as I think in the you'll see when I get to the exhibit, is what informs it, this moral obligations. And obviously, the Martin Luther King and social justice and political ecology also deeply informs this show. One thing I was talking about at lunch, as a curator, of course, you work as a team, and what I academically think about doesn't always get onto the walls, but, and that is to bring up the wider core team who, you know, we have a problem at the museum, and I think a problem in academia in general, of the lack of generous citation and acknowledgement of others. And my museum, the kind of big issue is the charismatic curator who gets up and pretends that they're the only one who did any of the work. That is not the case. Christina Solhan in the middle is probably one of the sole reasons that this exhibit ever happened, because I have little kids, I had other demands, and she called me to get it done. So I really wanted to call and shout out. But other than that, I mean, everyone here on the team, it was highly iterative. I had the crazy idea for the show, but this group kind of shaped it and constantly made it what it is. We had educator, we had exhibit designer Shannon Willis, we had 2 media experts, research assistants, writers, etc. And I always like to point this out because too often this labor is obscured. I mean, those of you who know museums, you know this work is done, but the public doesn't often hear about this. Or I should say hear about it enough. But so the exhibit then. So the exhibit in a nutshell tries to make this argument about relationality. Our mission at Natural History is to understand nature and our place in it. And often anthropology is seen as something outside of that, and there are a lot of historical reasons why. But then also anthropologists such as myself, who start working in the global South, there is this stereotype tradition of we only work with people that don't look like us or look like me. And so part of the thoughts behind this exhibit, again, was to try to create an inclusive exhibit that everyone and anyone could walk into and see someone that looks like themselves. Because the story of the cell phone is a human story, ecological story, a natural history story, but also a global story. And so what we tried to do in the exhibit, one way to think about it is the exhibit itself is kind of an exploded diagram of our devices, and it looks at the materials, the social, etc. 750 objects in the show, 37 personal profiles, which I'll get into, from 35 countries. So we really worked hard. We started the exhibit, the kind of nuts and bolts, after it kind of got restarted in late 2016. So from 2017, it opened in June 23rd, 2023. Obviously, a lot of that time, there was a slowdown due to the pandemic. And the group that you saw were kind of my through line to the pandemic. Having this project to work on really kept me going through the darkest days. And I think ultimately the pause actually helped us to refine the story, as I'll get into. The other things to note is that the show is designed for everyone, but there's a certain target audience. And the target audience of this show is 12 to 24-year-olds. We did that primarily and specifically because in Washington, D.C., and I suspect Pew data and others give us the kind of sense, and I'm sure it's true here, those of you with teenage kids know what I'm talking about, that generally that lower end of the demographic, so 12, is generally when most American children get a cell phone. Obviously, there are children who get them younger and older. So here we have a chance to teach them science with this thing that they are struggling with their parents with, that they themselves are struggling with. But then we also know that research in education and museum studies shows that if students lose interest in science, it tends to happen in that demographic as well. So we wanted to kind of teach people, in some ways, a very traditional natural history science and what anthropology is through this device that they're fixated on. Obviously, I've seen already some parents, we have docents trying to corral people into the exhibit at times, and I've heard of parents being like, oh, this is a show about cell phones, and then flee, given the kind of, in some views, the toxicities of this device and what it allows us. So that is a kind of double-edged sword. But the other thing to mention is that we worked very closely with, the middle slide is some of our, kind of our council. We had teens and young adults throughout the process kind of as informed panel, and we would show things to them. They'd say, wonderful, I want more of this, I don't understand this. We also did a series of national surveys to kind of get a sense of other things. So the show was, as much as we could during the pandemic, informed by a kind of survey and work. Now, before jumping to the show, if you know natural history, and I know some of you have been there, our museum is interestingly devoid of humans, or rather, humans have kind of been our traditional human halls, which by today's standard would be deeply problematic, have been really reduced. So the only hall that's still, human hall that's still up is, I should know where it is, it's right back here, African Voices. Now, when it came out in 2001, it was a deeply collaborative show, and so it's an example of the types of shows that we should have. But it is the last culture hall that is in our museum, which is a problem, right? The other human halls, we have Human Hall of Origins, we have, we've had the Outbreak show, which was about pandemics, and we have the Hall of Deep Time, which does talk about the contemporary. So the museum increasingly is trying to make the exhibits more relevant and kind of interdisciplinary. But we don't necessarily have halls the way we used to. We still, and in my view, problematic, we still have Egyptian and mummies on display. I'd like to see that change, but that's another conversation. But our exhibit, I should say, is tucked away over here. So in between this old bone, mammal bone hall, animal, and then mummies and insects, and then we have another temporary show called Objects of Wonder. And so we're kind of tucked away back here. This is Hall 27. It's 5,700 square feet. We chose this hall specifically because it has this programming studio. And that this is where we can hold about 40 students could come in and do public engagement. This is the kind of bubble plan, if you've seen these things. I'm gonna walk you through the bubble plan. 6 sections, each with a different thematic that that I'll get into. So if you've been to natural history, you know the issue with our museum is not so much visitors. We get about 4 to 5 million people a year. We have an intense rivalry about who gets more people than air and space. But once people come into our building, the problem is they generally, the argument is that people come to the Smithsonian twice in their life. Once as a child, then as an adult bringing their own children. That's not entirely true, but it creates a particular dynamic. So people come and they say, hey, I'm in the Smithsonian. I want to see everything in a day. So you might have 1 hour to capture their attention. And I use that term capture intentionally. So then the question becomes, how do you pull them away from dinosaurs? How do you pull them away from the Hope Diamond, which is they come to see? So we created this entryway experience, and I'll get into it in a little bit, but we created this cell phone forest, which is a dynamic display. They're basically 4 giant monitors that actually pull you into the exhibit. And we wanted to create this light area to pull people through. Interestingly, the Egyptian, not without its own problems, the Egyptian mummies pull people to this part in the exhibit, and then there's a bathroom on the other end. So people do have to pass through. Thankfully, they do stop and look at things. One thing I didn't mention is the sponsorship. The Smithsonian, as I was talking over lunch, we are a federal entity, so I'm a federal employee. Thank you for your tax dollars that support us. But we're also a trust entity. This exhibit could not have been done without the support of Qualcomm, which gave $3 million, and then T-Mobile, which gave us another $1 million. And that was, and whether you believe me or not, it was a very hands-off donation. We were not influenced by them. And I think the exhibit, we couldn't have done the exhibit without them. So I'm very, very in gratitude to their support. Alongside the Teen Council and alongside that support, we also had external kind of advisors who read the script throughout, a bunch of academics, some industry people, and then just really smart people, thoughtful people. And they kind of kept us honest. And I'm happy to, in the Q&A, get into the dynamics of sponsorship. But as I said to Neda Ulabi from NPR when she kind of pressed me on this issue, until we live in a society that 100% funds science and museums through federal dollars, we have to work with private industries. And that is just the reality. So this is what it looks like when people are full. They come in, and I'm showing you this image because what happens if you stand in these little circular areas, your head gets taken over by emojis, and you get emojified. And one of the things we were very aware of, there's the overt pulling people in, creating that selfie moment, but I also really wanted to supersize this device in your pocket to indicate that you're actually walking into the world of cell phones. And so I didn't put in the slide in the deck. On the other side is actually a vinyl graphic of what the inside of the phone. So literally you're walking into these devices. In addition to this emoji, you also get introduced to a group chat, which is an internet script that we designed because we realized, even though we didn't have the budget for it, we really needed to engage people with their phones, but engage people through or at the exhibit with their phones, but in a way that you wouldn't walk through the exhibit only looking at your phone. So it's basically a series of questions that then you anonymously answer, and it feeds into a video display at the end, which is cumulative. So it's a chance to kind of collect data anonymously, but also people to have this kind of as much as talking to AI or an internet script is an authentic experience, right? And to share and a point of conversation. We also then have throughout the show these kiosks. So if you don't have a phone, you can do that. At the center of this first section, so the first section after the intro is this section on resources and minerals. And here is where we get into the stuff and the people and the places that go into the making of your phone. This central graphic, what happens is it lights up. It lights up showing you there are 54 mineral specimens, and the 54 mineral specimens, depending on the component that are hanging above, up here, When that one lights up, it corresponds, the lights correspond to the mineral specimens out of which the elements are derived that make that piece, right? So making that connection between the earth and your device. 65 elements in the average smartphone. Going back to this notion of relationality, we make the point that it's 65 in your average smartphone. You have 24 elements in your body. So making that kind of connection and thinking through both through text and then objects, what does it mean to be in the world and to situate this device? Because I think what I hope people will take away is this just understanding that your device doesn't just come out of anywhere, but actually people and lots of processes going into making that. We lean into, so if you are a rock and mineral enthusiast, we have a whole bunch about minerals and elements. We also go into supply chains. So outside, as I'll get into shortly, are 8 cases or 4 cases with 8 examples where we walk through the supply chain. So very much wanted to lean into the kind of political economy of this. We also have this graphic that actually, I was mentioning this earlier, Qualcomm actually rightfully pointed out that we had no graphic that kind of leaned into this notion of research and design, and so that's something that we developed organically with their kind of pointing that out. So these then panels that are on the side, each one takes a different point of the cell phone supply chain. And so in this case, it's extraction, looking at tantalum and lithium. And in each case, what we do is we walk you through where the majority of tantalum is found. In this case, it's Democratic Republic of Congo. And then what is it used? And in this case, the capacitor generally. So we walk you from the earth to your phone and show you what all the steps, both processed, unprocessed. And then on the outside, and the other case, or side of the case, is lithium. And what we've done then, and this is where the personal perspectives come in. Leonard and Justine are 2 artisanal miners that we got connected through and worked with PAC International to interview. It was very important that, for me, and the team kind of warned me how much time this would take to actually put a human face on the supply chain and to put a human face on this global story. But then, of course, you have to do it ethically, right? So finding people who are willing to be in a museum, finding people who we either interviewed people directly or through proxies. Everyone got a chance to read their script. Everyone was compensated for their time. And we tried to do it as good as we can in the 21st century. And so these are their words on that side, and I'll give you another example. And so a variety of people. And again, here, one of the goals of the show, given that demographic of 12 to 24, not only everyone being able to see someone who looked like themselves and build that notion of empathy, but also hopefully inspire people with the next kind of generation of STEM and STEAM learners. So if this case was on extraction, then we have one on design where we feature aluminum and indium. And here I chose those elements because aluminum, of course, aluminum bauxite is one of the reasons that the glass is so durable. And then indium is one of those elements that makes your phone, the glass, so touchable. And so really that tangibility is one of those key things there. And lithium, of course, is used for your battery. Then we move over to manufacturing with gold and silicon. Harry, who's on the my left, your right, or your left, sorry. He works for IDEMIA and is actually based in Indonesia, and he makes SIM cards. So in the case of gold, we looked at SIM. We also, with gold, because humans have been using it for 5,000 years, we had a chance to bring out some of her historical objects. There, of course, given the issues around displaying objects, worked very hard to make sure that anything historical on display we obtained ethically, which we can talk about. Then we have a section on recycling and looking at copper and neodymium. And here, of course, where copper still is king of sorts. Copper is a big source, Michigan, at least upper Michigan. And so we leaned into copper material, both from the Americas, copper culture as it's known. So we have a metal knife or a copper knife, as well as an Inca piece, a hairpin, as well as West Mexican copper axe money. And here I wanted to kind of foreground indigenous metalworking within this larger story. So if that is the kind of core of the show in terms of working through, as I mentioned, we have these personal perspectives. And we worked very hard to get a wide range of people. And I'm not going to get into all of them because I'm already running out of time. So the next kind of major section is this infrastructure section. And here, Crown Castle very graciously came and built these cell phone towers for us. They actually, at my request, made, you can see it here, they cut out to show you the inside of the antenna array, because part of the subtext of the show, the unseen connections, not only these people that I showed you, as well as the labor that we're trying to foreground, but also just the stuff. And so here, one of my favorite parts is actually walk through, and I had fascinating discussions with engineers, telecom engineers, about all the stuff. If you were to make a call from Washington, D.C. to Madagascar, all the wires. So we walk you through all the stuff, undersea cables, etc. Just to give a call out to Kayla here, Malasuma Ramez Cruz. She's Zapotec speaker, and her community actually, after the national government or national telecom in Mexico wouldn't build the cellular infrastructure, their community built it. So in this section, we talk about the way infrastructure works, the science behind spectrum, et cetera, but also inequality and redlining, and the fact that there's piggybacking and not access is not, unfortunately, yet for everyone. We built a game called Are You There?, which is a kind of take off of Chutes and Ladders, to kind of reinforce what you learn, hopefully, in the show. But I'll just show you back here, one of perhaps the trickiest things we worked through was thinking about the Gs, so 1G, 2G, the generations of cellular service. And if you remember back in 2020, 5G, and still now, 5G was very controversial. So we kind of think through the hopes and the anxieties around 5G in the show and kind of lean into that a bit. Across the hall, and perhaps not surprisingly given that I'm an anthropologist, my favorite section is this cultural uses. I was trained at Oxford. The Pitt Rivers is my kind of go-to museum. And I bring that up because I like lots of stuff. And so there's a battle in the show about, like, less is more, Josh. And I'm like, no, it's not. We got to have more. I won the battle here. And what you do is when you walk in, and I'll show you, but there's this basically wall of technological nostalgia of materials from 1973 to about 2008. All the stuff that your phone has largely subsumed. Not necessarily replaced, but largely subsumed. We have this anchoring phone here, and then because of cell phones, leans into cultural elaborations that happened afterwards. In this section, the overwhelming message, I hope, is that technology doesn't come along and make us all the same, but that it actually helps communities to actually do things differently, that indigenous people use technology as much as us, that innovation is tradition. And if you've read the fantastic book by the Maraca Media, Phone and Spear, Jennifer Deeger is the settler colonial anthropologist involved with that. Here's Kayleen, who she uses her phone in her Arnhem Land Yonglu community to make these fascinating mosaics, photo mosaics, and they've made this wonderful film, Ringtone, which explores that. So again, the idea is that cell phones don't come along and necessarily flatten everything. This is what that looks like in design, and then what it looks like closer in the wall. What we found is that, perhaps not surprising, we kind of had anticipated this, is that people come and immediately gravitate like, oh, I had that. Mom, Dad, what is that? So it becomes this moment, an interesting thing where a point of reflection about identity and technology, gender, also just public-private, and thinking about transformations in that domain. Most of this stuff came from our houses. We did that because I wanted an open display, and it was actually an excuse to put on display things that I've been holding on to in my basement for many years. But, you know, and in some cases we had to buy things. But there are a lot of Easter eggs in here. This is where the dispossessed, I also got Frankenstein, a copy of Frankenstein there, and Octavia Butler, matriarchs of science fiction. But if this is the kind of before cell phones, then we shift and think through because of. One of the things I didn't mention is the tone of the show. We tried to channel Trevor Noah, and we did that because informative, slightly snarky, and we figured it would resonate well with our audience members. I mentioned that because, you know, for style, the title is Work It. For language, which you can't see, it's Say It. So that kind of had some influence there. In this section, this is where I lean into that, you know, famous and beloved, or depending on you are, hated aphorism that anthropology, you know, makes the familiar strange and the strange familiar. And what I wanted to do was mix things up. So we have, on the one hand, this fantasy coffin, which was commissioned, never used, and bought by African Art. It's a Nokia cell phone. And so that raises the question about why would one want to be buried in a giant cell phone coffin? And then alongside that, we put a variety of things like joss paper. So spirit money, which is burned in China and other contiguous countries to offerings for the ancestors. And here cell phones are part of that, electronics. But then also, if we thinking about connecting, we wanted to highlight the fact that there are a lot of people out there, and maybe some of you, do not want to be connected. So anti-facial recognition paint, sadly it doesn't work as much as one would like. And then things like a Faraday pouch. So again, thinking about, in this section on connecting, both unseen as well as the body, we have a microscope, telescope, etc. We also had then a section on M-Pesa, because if we're going to talk about conflict minerals and mining and artisanal mining and the impacts, we wanted a story that most Americans don't know, which is the amazing story of M-Pesa and the ways in which that has kind of transformed East Africa, etc. And this is Mercy Mazel, who's a businesswoman out of Mombasa. We also then feature Wendy Wang here, who's a graduate student who uses, WeChat as well. We do have a theater, which kind of reinforces the idea that all cell phone uses are cultural. And we have about 8 to 10 clips of different ethnographic films. The one on the screen is Dara Blackwater, who's a Navajo legal scholar who fights for indigenous sovereignty in terms of telecoms, etc. Section 5 is infrastructure. And here, this is where we come back to the sustainability message. And we give people a pathway of, and this is I have too many slides, so I had to be very selective. But this is actually a drawer, and you probably all have one, a drawer of electronics. So you can open this up and see a bunch of phones. And we walk you through what are the implications if you keep it, if you throw it away, if you trade it in or sell it, if you recycle it, if you repair it, etc. And so leaning into this kind of this, as we put up in this title, Now What? Because we know it would be very easy to do this exhibit where it would be very overwhelming. And so we're always trying to walk this line of opening the door to difficult subjects, overwhelming subjects, but in a way that didn't alienate our visitors and kept them kind of coming back. Interestingly, we did not anticipate that this sculpture, which is about 460 cell phones that Sun King, a recycler outside of Brockport, or in Brockport, as well as Hobby International, another recycler, they pulled out of the waste stream for us about 400, 500 cell phones, which we put on display. My colleagues very dutifully took out the batteries of all these phones, which is another story. But we put them on display, and what this has become is another iconic part of the exhibit where everyone comes to find their first cell phone. And so people talk about their cell phones, which goes back to the idea of how deeply embedded cell phones are. You know, part of my methodology with my colleagues at George Washington University is we always do cell phone biography and ask people about how many cell phones, what are your stories about, and this actually has just become this wonderful prompt. We have these 3 videos which are by these wonderful MICA students, the Maryland Institute of College of Art, and they did an internship with us and made videos about planned obsolescence, repair, and then just more ethical design. And so they're on a loop here. We also developed a repair game, and so this leaned into some of the work I've done, as well as the wonderful work that is promoted by iFixit and the repair just initiative that's out there. And so this gives people a chance to kind of lean in and play with repairing their device. The last section is about influence. So here we go think about society. This is done, it's a complete comic book that we commissioned for the show. And we did that in part because you could imagine having teen profiles, what teen would agree to have their picture in a museum. So we figured doing graphic novel comic book would be a way to foreground the research that my colleagues and others have done and to kind of play with, you know, this idea, or not play, just explore the idea of what are these devices. And if you were looking at the New York Times today, as I did, the furor about TikTok, every day there's something. I mean, there was just right now, Atlantic has a new piece about why no one should have a cell phone until they're 16. So realizing this is a touchstone topic for a lot of people, we wanted a space where people could explore that through the graphic novel, comic book. We had the idea for 3 characters, Mateo, Tony, and Nadia. But it really wasn't until we worked with Carrie Randolph, who's an acclaimed artist, Marvel, DC, and Independence, and then his partner in crime, Joanna Shar, who's the writer, that we really realized this. So again, another iterative process of making this. If you look at the comic book, there are these white panels which get into particular topics, and then these black interstitial panels get into heavier topics. The topics, the heavy topics that we get into are social justice, circulation of images of violence, social social media and self-perception. We also misinformation, and then the last one is bias in tech. The kind of larger panels where the 3 characters interact and it's kind of a day in their life in Washington, D.C. This one, Mateo, who's our kind of tech skeptic environmentalist, is doom scrolling. And I don't know if you're like me, I've been doom scrolling often of late. And so, Tony, who's the kind of moderator, his cousin, comes in and pulls him out of his bedroom and doom scrolling and out into the world to kind of do more direct action and not just ruminate. Nadia is our kind of super social media guru, and here she is cosplaying and talking about wearing hijab and inspiring her cousin who lives, I believe, in Indiana, and empowering her to kind of celebrate her identity. The other one we do is thinking about privacy and geolocation and the implications of that. The comic book has been very successful, and I can get into kind of feedback at the end of this. But least people think that technology is birthed, and we are kind of in this doom cycle with it. We wanted to feature about 14 people who are change makers, who are at the intersection of social justice, environmental justice, and just making tech better. And this will kind of cycle in and out. And again, all of these people were contacted and asked to be part of the show. Now, and I've done 45 minutes, but I'm almost done. The end of the show brings you to the studio. And I mentioned this because the studio is a space in which we can host people. And what do we do in that space? We'll be doing it tomorrow a bit, exploding objects, taking things apart to think about how cell phones are made. But then also we have this, we made a board game. I was part of it, but I cannot take credit for it, Phone of the Future. I'm very proud of this board game as a board game enthusiast. And this is a board game that you don't use your cell phone for, but you actually 5 people collaborate, 4 or 5 people collaborate to build a cell phone and think through how to build an ethically sourced and then kind of ethically designed cell phone. And so world events happen, such as mining strikes, new taxation, or new innovations that allow your component either help you or hinder you in doing that. And we hope through doing a game like that we can actually teach people science, so it revolves around a periodic table. The other thing to mention in terms of output is the show, the kind of new model for our shows. The show will be up for minimum 3 years, most likely 5, is that we have a DIY. And what that means is we've reduced, and I can tell you I struggled with this, and if the team were here, they would tell you, yes, he struggled with this, reducing the show down to 15 panels. That then you can print on demand, so that you could actually put up the display here and then tweak it and add it. I won small victories in that the comic book will be available as a PDF, and all 37 profiles will be a PDF that you can then print, etc. So that's a way in which we can push some of this content out into the world, and it's been very successful with Outbreak. So in thinking about the show, there are lots of things I could say. I think for me, it was a kind of attempt to push the museum to think about anthropology differently, to again remind people that anthropology at its best is about everyone and anything that humans do. And right now, it's hard to think of something outside of cell phones that we do. I will tell you that it took a while for people at the museum to get their heads around this show, because it is a very different show if you've been to our museum than a lot of our current exhibits. But I have to give credit to the team and to people like Lonnie Bunch, who kind of early on in 2019, which helped us, kind of came out and made this argument that the Smithsonian has to be a place where people can come to talk about difficult things. Whether we do it perfectly is another question, but hopefully this exhibit is part of a kind of push to rethink anthropology, to argue for anthropology's continued kind of relevance, because I would argue if we take out humans out of a natural history museum, we've kind of lost as a species. However, as you know, how we do it and the means by which we address both the complicated history and in the present is going to take a lot of work. And this is at least a beginning gesture of that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Josh.
Questions?
Yes. Okay, we have a...
And please feel free to ask me anything.
First of all, thank you so much for coming out and sharing all this hard work. It's very clear that you and your team put a lot into this, and it's incredible how much you guys were able to fit into this exhibit. And so I must ask, was there anything you guys wanted to include that you were not able to for whatever reason?
Yeah, I would often joke about the various hills I was prepared to die on, and then I would quickly retreat. Yeah, there were a lot of, early on we identified, for example, how both telemedicine and particularly as we were going through the pandemic, we're like, oh, we should do that. I got stethoscope in there. But we don't lean into that. That would be a topic I would love to explore. All the issues around, and then ASL and the way in which, for accessibilities, the way in which cell phone has both made that newly available, or rather amplified and helped with accessibilities, issues we haven't. So one of the tricks with the exhibit is that, fairly or not, education becomes the kind of bin in which we put things. Like, we'll have a panel on this. Then, of course, doing the panel is the trick. With everything, I think, with every different section could be an exhibit in and of itself. If the labor issues or anything about mining, that could be an exhibit in and of itself. So it was very clear that to kind of tell this global story the way we wanted to tell it, because I think we had to kind of, at some level, cut and work at a higher level. Because I think one of the challenges of the cell phone is that it bundles so much in it, both materially in terms of political economies, but then also just functionality, that a lot of times, too often, scholars, in my view, necessarily, right, focus on one thing over another. And so I really wanted to try to do a show which told as much as possible the widest story. Now, that comes at some cost because, how do you talk about conflict minerals in 100 words? So, yeah. So there are lots of things, but yeah.
Thanks for that. Questions? Oh, there's one in the front.
Josh, I have so many questions. One of the questions is when we think of anthropology collections, we think of the Pit Rivers and old historical objects. Is the Smithsonian now collecting cell phones? Is that part of the collection?
That's a great question, and thank you for that, because there were multiple times where either during the research I had colleagues be like, "You're doing what? What is happening?" And so I had originally, for that giant wall in my dream, so going back to your idea about what we didn't do, American history has all these amazing things. We have Run DMC's boombox. I wanted to put that in the show. That's already on display. If I wanted to borrow that, I would have had to put it in a box, humid, climate controlled, and then I'd have it for 6 months and then it'd go back. So we had to very quickly say, right, we have to use everyday objects, at least for that one part. And then the other part, actually, a lot of it I collected. And so we have made a decision at a museum, there's no longer props. And so then there are loans by curators, but I didn't want to use anything of my own. So I would collect things and then donate it to the department, we accessioned it, rather, not donate. I gave it and then we accessioned it. So it became part of the exhibit. So we do have this interesting now set of cell phone cases. So we have about 30 cell phone cases. I collected pop culture cell phones, anything from, Spider-Man, Wonder Woman, to Liverpool, to D.C., et cetera, to Native American. There's this great outfit, 8th Generation, that works with Native artists, their material. And so in that case, for the cell phone cases, I actually did 2 collections. One thought was originally things were just going to be on display, but now we have an interesting conservation experiment of how are these things going to fare, this plastic after 5 years, and we have a set in the collections. I commissioned a lot of work, so there's a painting by Pax Jerup, who's a Papua New Guinean artist from the highlands of New Guinea, and so I commissioned a painting from him. I also commissioned an amazing bag from an Ojibwe, well, it's more complicated tribal affiliation than that, but yes, Jenny Kappelman, who's an enrolled Red Lake Ojibwe with lineage to Leech Creek and White Earth Ojibwe. It's sadly here, so you can't see it. But yeah, everything with a few exceptions. This kente cloth shirt is from Lisa Aronson, who works in Africa, and she lent it, but most things we actually acquired. So now we do have, cell phone models, all the cell phones in the show, once I started this project, interestingly, everyone in the museum just started bringing me their cell phones. So I use them in teaching and we take them apart, but then also we put them on display, so a lot. So we are not collecting electronics, because that's American history does that. And they have in electronics, they have Rudy Giuliani's cell phone from 9/11 and other kind of crazy things like that, which I didn't really want to borrow.
So even with cell phones, there are a lot of different manufacturing companies around the world. There's Apple, but there are also Chinese companies like Huawei or Korean companies like Samsung. Do you find that manufacturing processes tend to differ depending on the manufacturer's origin, or not that at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the fascinating thing about this was that we tried very hard to talk to people. Being in the federal government, I couldn't work with Huawei. That was just off the table. Up front with that. But, you know, no company really wants to get into manufacturing. I mean, there are accounts out there. So more or less they're the same. What's interesting and what differs is the components. And so when I tried to come up with the figure for 65 elements, no one was willing to give me a breakdown of like what stuff. Now, you go into their environmental reports and Apple will tell you that, you know, they use a lot of recycled tantalum or rare earths. I have to believe them because I don't know what else, but we don't have those specifics. So the basic building blocks of every phone are more or less the same. It's just slightly tweaked. The manufacturing processes are the same. Labor conditions may change, but you know, if you know the story of cell phones, I mean, it is a global network. And so Foxconn, et cetera, they're all kind of interrelated and they use a lot of the same suppliers. So, yeah.
Yeah, we have a question.
I see a lot of stuff related to hardware, and I was wondering if there's like any software related topic other than the 5Gs, like the Gs stuff.
Yeah, I mean, we do talk very explicitly. I mean, I think one of the things that was pointed out to us is it's 3G was right when your device could get onto the internet, right? We do have in the show, Siku is an Inuit-based program that Inuit in far north Canada use to document sea ice. So we have that program and a film about that program. Also in the language section, we talk about emojis. And we talk about Japanese cell phone novels, which the Japanese pioneered the cell phone twitlet that then we kind of elaborated and kind of has fizzled off. But yeah, we couldn't get into, another thing we couldn't talk about was TikTok. We talk about M-Pesa, which is a delivery system. We talk about, we do make a point in the show about surveillance capitalism, that, you know, the difference between, let's say, us and China is just degrees in terms of privacy and surveillance. So we do make that point. But in terms of nitty-gritty of software, not really, because that would be a tremendous thing to do. So we do in the survey have a question about apps, what apps, and we give people functionalities, but you know, that ecosystem is so diverse that to kind of capture that. And that gets to something that was raised with me very early on is like, how can you do a show like this and it stay relevant because it's so fast moving? Partly that's an ideology of the technology, right, the companies, but it's also a reality. And so we focused on, and you see that most in the ecosystem with apps, like, you know, my work with teens started in 2016 and went to about 2020. Snapchat, you know, depending on who you talk to, I mean, then it was king. Now, is it anymore? Not really. I mean, I'm a Facebook user, and, you know, the younger people in the room, like, I've been told explicitly that's for old people like me. You know, so I think that's, again, where educational programming comes in. So we've talked about having panels to talk about that. I plan to have a panel bringing people in like Amanda Leanhart, who works at Common Sense Media and others, Data and Society, to talk about those ecosystems, because I would like to push back a little bit against the utter panic, because if you know, there's a very dystopian view of this technology, and obviously in an election year, there's reason to be worried. There was a new piece today about AI and fakes, right? And conversely, I don't want to be utopian, and so I fall very much in the middle. So thinking about these apps and what this technology is and isn't doing to us is something that we're going to have to explore outside of the exhibit, because we can't go in and tweak things. So we made a decision to not feature certain apps, and it also gets into a lot of weird proprietary stuff that we didn't want to have to deal with, but thanks.
Okay, Jack?
Hi.
Hi.
So I know you said that this exhibition had a rather long journey before it came to fruition, and I assume then that you had multiple opportunities to collect accordingly, materials along the way while you were doing that parallel research. So how often would you say that something similar occurs, where curators or staff are donating, then accessioning either personal items or artifacts for the sake of an exhibition? And do they then expect in the 3 to 5 years, once the exhibition closes, for those materials to be de-accessioned, for that to be returned?
Yeah, so to clarify, certain objects we donated and they were accessioned. All the personal things from my basement will be coming back to my basement, much to my wife's chagrin. Yeah, so it was a mix there, and we as a team kind of had a slight competition about who could find what to donate, right? And there are a lot of Easter eggs in that. One of my colleagues actually donated her photo album of a road trip, and she made sure that her friends who are in the pictures are okay. Another donated a wallet, letters, etc. Yeah, so the things that were accessioned into Anthro as part of their collection, we don't de-accession really unless ethical return, or in some cases, repatriation. So I envision that these materials that I collected for the show will be there for the next 50, 100 years until the policy changes, right? But yeah.
Any more questions? Yes. On?
Is that better? Oh, yeah. Okay. So I know you talked a little bit about feedback, and so I was just going to ask a little bit more about how did you measure feedback from visitors on this exhibit, and I don't know, more of the details, like did you have to filter through any non-legitimate feedback, or was there anything that surprised you about it, responses that you didn't expect, anything like that?
That's a great question. So just to remind you, we do have this kind of, this is where the data visualization is. So we haven't done an exit survey yet. So we haven't started doing our visitor surveys. And that's where we have staff from education comes in, and we have a survey service at the Smithsonian that does a study. My challenge with that survey data, like any survey data, is how representative. Like if someone comes, 19-year-old from Spain, like, okay, like their opinion's valid, but it's a complicated thing. So it's very spotty, but they do it over a period. The feedback we've gotten so far is we had a summer solstice event where the Smithsonian stays open from 5 to midnight as part of the summer solstice. We had a DJ of the Wizards came, DJ Heat, and so everyone, if you know our museum, people were dancing in the rotunda until midnight. We had, in 7 hours, 20,000 people come through the show. And that was in part because that part of the museum was open, so they kind of, if they were going to go, but it was mobbed, and people really responded well to it. When we've done school groups, we do this exploded cell phone exercise. It's booked always. So it's the single most popular program that the students do. And the feedback informal is that, I get the occasional, why didn't you do this, or why not more of this? But overwhelming, it's very positive. I've had colleagues express with like real sincerity how pleased they are to see a contemporary show. I've had a woman, Tony, one of the characters, Joanne, felt very strongly that she uses a cane and she wanted someone with some different ability in the show with that. And, had a woman come up and say, I've never seen someone with a cane like me before. So anecdotally, it's very positive. We have yet to get a negative review. Washington Post quibbled, the art critic quibbled that we didn't talk about Japanese Twitter novels enough. But so far it's been positive, which I don't mind. I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. But I mean, so far, I think, as I said in part of the talk, the biggest thing is when, we try to pull people in and parents are like, oh no, cell phones, no way. So I think it's one of those shows that people walk into. I've watched people walk in because the bathroom's there. So sometimes they come and they're like, oh, where are the Egyptian mummies? And they have to walk through, and then they're like, what have I walked into? And then they start looking, and they stop, and usually there's good wait time. It's not a zip through. So so far positive, but I don't unfortunately have that data yet.
We have another question here.
You guys are being very nice, by the way. Good questions.
We're nice.
I know.
We're in the Midwest.
You mentioned kind of shifting the mindset a little bit to a more human-centered and also a contemporary exhibit, and I was wondering, based on feedback and insights that you and the rest of the team have gained from this exhibit, are you seeing more interest, more plans for further development in that sphere?
Yeah, I think, well, one of I'm chair of the department right now, which gives me some power for 4 years. So I can push in a certain direction, which I plan to. And everyone at the museum knows that. Yes, I mean, we still have a challenge. For example, we're rebooting our Objects of Wonder, which is essentially cabinet of curiosity of like, what is natural history? There's some great stories, human-centered stories, but we have challenges with that. Like, if you've seen the new NAGPRA regulations around what can and cannot be on display, while we do not fall under NAGPRA, we want to follow the spirit. So then that means, we shouldn't have anything on display that hasn't had proper consultation. So that means building into our exhibit process that consultation, as opposed to a phone call, hey, is this object okay, to a tribal authority. So that's going to take a lot of work. I think we still have this issue because of our collections within anthropology. How do you properly do a show that acknowledges the painful past and continuing present that we live within that most people don't think about, and highlight some of the amazing materials we have, but with the communities on whose land we occupy, as well as whose territory we were with, and in some cases, took lawfully or were gifted to, et cetera. So how do you foreground those stories? But again, if natural history is done well, it has to be about everyone. And so Outbreak did it in a way, but there's a huge history to overcome and misunderstandings. And at the end of the day, as a colleague pointed out to me, he's a geologist and Miamia, Tim McCoy, and he made the point to me, look, if I put an asteroid on display, at the end of the day, if the public don't understand that is like cool asteroid that has this mineral composition, that's fine, because they'll walk away and be like, that's a rock from space. Like anthropology, you can't do that. Basket, you have to unpack. There's just all this complexity. And so we are helped by the fact that at the Smithsonian we have the National Museum of American Indian, we have NAMAC, the National Museum of African Culture History, African Art, etc. But then people wonder, well, why is this stuff? So partly it's leaning into that understanding nature and our place in it, but doing it in a way that is both, I think, explicit about the painful past, but then thinking about what we need to do in the present. So it's a challenge. It's a challenge. I hope so, is the answer.
Do you have any more questions? Oh, Jesse.
Uh-oh.
Thank you. Oh, thanks, Josh. It's great to see you, and we really appreciate you coming. It's not an uh-oh comment.
I was teasing you.
But so I will just share that Ricky and I went in February, and we loved the exhibit. It's so colorful and engaging, and I was really impressed. It turned out that we went backwards through the exhibit, in fact, because we had come in from the Constitution Avenue entrance, but it was great that way as well. I liked the graphic novel. I guess just one comment that really interested me is that when you think about repair, I really appreciated how you brought that in. But when I think about repair and kind of information studies, basically, there's this kind of idea that there's a sort of devolution, right? Like, and it's kind of like a, rich north, global south kind of thing where, we have all of this great technology and infrastructure, and as it breaks down, we sell it off to someone who can then afford it, and then it goes down until you get to like the people salvaging the ships in West Africa and making new things out of these sort of raw materials. So I was really interested that this kind of, I feel like, is a very different narrative, you know, because there's this actual sort of global circulation that's happening, and I was kind of wondering, is, you know, you are thinking about globalization and anthropology, sort of like, is this a different kind of materialism that we're seeing, or a different kind of narrative, and is it because of this digital nature, or is it something else that's sort of bringing that out?
Yeah, no, I mean, the repair work, that's my favorite ethnography that I've participated in, because it just brings together a lot of stuff, and it was a fascinating way to talk to the repair techs and then quickly learn that they were buying the spare parts, because then it was more modular. People would actually replace the glass as opposed to the whole unit. So this was 2012, 13, and they were buying their things from the same companies that were selling them to the big names, right, who make the handsets. And they were kind of operating in this weird space that, was it fully legit or not? The right to repair movement has really shifted that narrative, and I think all of the handset manufacturers, particularly Apple, have realized that they have to repair. Like there's a market there, and sustainability. So when I started, there were a bunch of people who were already doing some of this work. So in part, like, I could work with them and piggyback and talk with them. And I'm forgetting the anthropologist who I touched base with for Ibriam, the copper burner. But, Candace, who's pictured here, was someone I worked with in Washington, D.C. So I think repair, I don't know when it kind of hit, but it is now one of those hot topics, because it was probably like 2018 I started seeing things come out. And as part of just waste and thinking about end of life or circular economy. So it does get us to think about things in an interesting way. We knew, given, I don't know how many of you have repaired your own cell phone, right? Are you willing to open up the device and try? I've not with recent ones. I'm happy to open up others. But we wanted to create a non-judgmental space to just think through the implications. So as you pointed out, like the drawer part thinks through, like, hey, there's these many metric tons of copper basically sitting in people's houses in their drawers. And then walk through. And we wanted to, I think the hardest thing was getting images that were not just, if you Google e-waste, you just get pictures of Agaboshi and just burning fires, right? And then that feeds into a particular narrative about the global south, when the reality is, and particularly as China shifted its supply chain of what it's taking, it's now very diverse. So geographers like Josh Lepowski have done work Latin America. And so he was very helpful, and others, to kind of remind us of, like, hey, you need to think about different images. We knew Sun King we stumbled upon Sun King actually, and they were very willing. And Lakshmi is actually immigrant from Bhutan who works there, and I've forgotten his colleague's name, but they both work at Sun King on the recycling chain there. And so we wanted people to see that it's actually here in our backyard as well. So that was part of the thinking, to kind of foreground that, because there are a lot of narratives about what it is. I mean, we feature in the Changemakers, and again, I'm blanking on his name now, out of LA, fantastic group, it'll come to me after the talk, who actually works with formerly incarcerated individuals, and they work to repair, devices for people. So it's about repairing people and repairing things. And so, for sustainability, because, the overwhelming message for this part of the show and just in general is that the most ecological device is the one you have. And that's because 80% of the carbon footprint is in the making. And that obviously entails the mining and everything else. So the longer you can hold on your device, the better will be. Whether you can hold on it that long is another question. But yeah.
Any more? I could ask a question. And it's about sponsorship. So I saw you have T-Mobile and Qualcomm. I just wonder if there were, when corporate sponsors give, sometimes they have conditions, and I wonder if there were particular conditions that they imposed that you had to like push back, and how did that go?
Yeah, no, Qualcomm is an amazing sponsor, as is T-Mobile. I mean, I think both of them had never really done this before, so partly it was educating them about what was permissible and what wasn't. And we had some tricky things, like, to do the infrastructure section, I can read about cellular infrastructure, but it's not the same as talking to an industry expert and an engineer. So we started working, met an engineer for Sprint, which then got bought up by T-Mobile. The conversation with T-Mobile had already started, and then we started talking to their tech people, and we worked very hard to kind of divide those conversations. So I was never in the room where we talked about money. And they vetted the script. There were parts that they did not like, and we said, we're keeping them. You can either decide to sponsor the show or not, and to their credit, they decided to. Qualcomm, I think, has a vested interest in kind of becoming, coming out of the shadow of other companies who are more well-known. And they just really appreciated this, their whole kind of getting people to understand the technology of chip manufacturing kind of coincides interestingly with our unseen connections. So they're very supportive. And, obviously there are benefits to being a sponsor. So there were packages that we designed. So I believe there's a certain amount of events that they can hold in the space and that sort of thing. And obviously being in Washington, D.C., you connect the dots of why that might be appealing. But, that's some of the realities. I mean, I stand by the show. I think, people may think that we were bamboozled. I don't think we were, and they were really wonderful to work with. So I'm deeply appreciative of their sponsorship. But it was a learning experience for all of us. And NMNH has not had corporate sponsorship at this level. I think it's the largest corporate gift that we've gotten for a show. I believe I'm right about that. So that, people were like, oh, but other museums take that money all the time. I mean, Air and Space it's Jeff Bezos is basically paying for that revamp. So it's interesting. But there's a lot of interesting things to work through about science, civic engagement, capitalism, etc. So, yeah.
Great. I think we have one more question.
Yeah, I have a silly question, and you left off with capitalism, so it'll start my question. So typically with new exhibits at the Smithsonian, there's always like a little, like at the gift shop, there's something new. Are you planning to sell your new game?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Actually, we're going to give the game away for free, I think. And I say that because, everyone asked us about that, and we're like, oh. I mean, I think if we sold it, it would be the cost of it is to make it nice. And so you'll see if you come to the workshop, we have nice mats. We did play it with Labyrinth Games, which is a fantastic board game shop in D.C. And they were very kind. They tried to, if you play with hardcore board gamers, they figure out how to win very quickly. They did that, but still lost, which was a wonderful teaching moment. And they told me, it was a very backhanded compliment. They were like, yeah, this is better than we thought. I don't know if you would actually, play this constantly, but it's actually a lot of fun. So we're working that out. I think we're going to make it part of the DIY because I would rather people play it and engage than, not play it. I think we will actually make a bunch and send them out as part of DIY kits. So I forgot to mention Google very kindly donated a bunch of Pixel phones that we take apart. Also Crown Castle built the infrastructure. So we have been successful in that outreach. So we're trying to lower the bar because at the end of the day, what I really want people to do is just, it's part of that taking apart. I believe firmly in the idea that knowledge is power, and too often technology is misunderstood. So the more the exhibit can help us break down those things, the better. So, there is a T-shirt. They designed a T-shirt They took my advice about what books to stock, which I was shocked about. But the shop is separate from, they're a trust entity, so they do their own thing. But yeah, it's going to be available.
Oh, just a reminder, the workshop tomorrow, we still have spots. So if you want to break or explode, yes, things, cell phone things, please, you can still register by sending us an email. We have 5 spots, so it's first come, first serve. It's at 10 a.m. tomorrow at Rackham. So I'm gonna ask the last question, which is has nothing to do with this exhibit. So what's next? What's the other exhibit that you're working on?
Yeah, people started asking me that as soon as it opened, and I'll tell you, I've never worked. Never. This is one of the longest projects that I've ever done. So to have it actually come out, and the next idea for an exhibit project would be to actually revisit the U.S. exploring expedition, so as well as the North Pacific. I am really struck, particularly now at this present moment, where we're working through issues of ongoing the legacies of colonialism, the ongoing issues around settler colonialism. I would love to do a show that actually uses those historic pieces, but in dialogue with contemporary artists, and commission new pieces. So it would be an exhibit of kind of dialogue between the new and the old to make a point about survivance, that indigeneity is of the present. Because, you know, I've run into a bunch of scholars and activists who have kind of commented that sometimes museums become traps of what indigeneity should be. And so I want to try to think through what it could be and sources of inspiration. So drawing on recovering voices, but very specific. And also, you know, where I work in Papua New Guinea, everything is culture. There is no nature. So breaking down those divisions and having botanical things alongside, you know, baskets, etc. But working with communities. Having said that, I know that working with communities takes a long time, so I have to think about it so that it's not a 20-year project.
Okay, with that, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Josh,
Thank you
for this generative presentation.